I was waiting for a train at Waterloo last Tuesday, sitting next to a woman who was staring so intently at her phone she seemed to have forgotten to breathe. She wasn't just scrolling, she was gripped. Every few seconds, she'd let out a sharp, audible huff, the kind of sound you make when you've just been personally insulted. When the delayed sign finally flashed on the departures board, she turned to me, her eyes wide with a frantic sort of certainty. "See," she said, thrusting her screen toward my face. It was a chaotic mix of grainy protest footage and a headline screaming about societal collapse in bold, jagged fonts. "It's all ending. Musk was right. Civil war is inevitable. We're witnessing the erasure of our entire civilization." She said it with a strange kind of relish, almost as if the catastrophe was the only thing that made sense to her anymore. What was striking wasn't just her anger, but the scale of it. Here we were, in a relatively clean, functioning station, surrounded by people calmly buying overpriced lattes and browsing bookshops, yet in her pocket, the world was literally on fire. She didn't want to talk about the train schedule or the weather. She was hunting for Ragebait, that specific brand of digital adrenaline that makes everything feel like an existential threat. This is the reality of CAPS LOC Britain. We've entered an era where nuance is treated like a weakness, and hyperbole is the only language we speak. It's why the Prime Minister's approval ratings aren't just low, they've plummeted to a net 966, a depth of unpopularity unseen since the 1970s. It's why, while 71% of us are convinced the country is heading toward a cliff edge, the rest of the world ironically ranks brand Britain as one of the most stable, attractive, and influential nations on Earth. We are living through a bizarre paradox. A country that is objectively prized by the outside world, yet inhabited by a population that feels like it's trapped in a terminal tailspin. The question is, are things actually falling apart, or have we simply surrendered our perspective to an algorithm that profits from our collective despair? Welcome to the Deep Dive. Our mission today is to unpack exactly how this atmosphere of pervasive digital pessimism is shaping our perception of reality, from domestic political consensus to global economics, specifically in relation to China's Belt and Road Initiative, and how certain governments in Southeast Asia are attempting to govern this new digital hyperbole. We have a fascinating stack of material that connects the political mood swings in the UK with machine learning studies on toxicity in Indonesia, legal frameworks designed to maintain social stability in Singapore, and deep economic analysis. We're going to distill the essential nuggets of knowledge for you to understand this new landscape.
And it's a crucial mission because the very atmosphere we operate in, what we call the attention economy, demands hyperbole. If you are not shouting that the world is ending, the algorithm doesn't notice you. If you don't use absolute language, you're invisible. We have to acknowledge this digital environment where reductive language, the kind that eliminates nuance, is financially incentivized. Our deep dive today is about forcing ourselves to move beyond those screaming headlines and the relentless pressure to feel doom. We must look at the concrete evidence, the machine learning data on online toxicity, the field research on infrastructure development, and the precise legal texts governing digital platforms, to regain a perspective that fundamentally rejects the idea that collective despair is the default state of human affairs.
Okay, let's unpack this culture of crisis, starting with the language we use, because it seems there's this genuine cultural tendency toward exaggeration, particularly in politics and media.
Oh, absolutely. We see global leaders using a vocabulary that's just.
Yeah.
It's designed to maximize emotional impact, right?
Right, like when you hear a figure like former President Trump describe things as happening like never before.
Or the flip side of that, describing a peace deal as the end of an age of terror. It sets this benchmark of extremity.
And it normalizes hyperbole across the board.
And this isn't, it isn't limited to one side of the aisle or one country. You see the same pattern emerging in the UK.
Definitely. Figures like Nigel Farage talking about the country being on the verge of societal collapse.
And then prominent tech figures like Elon Musk, just amplifying that by predicting that civil war in Britain is inevitable.
It's like public figures aren't aiming for careful consideration anymore.
No, it's a contest of extremity.
And the professional media landscape just follows that trend, rushing to maximize everything.
Every dip in the market, every political disagreement is suddenly a permanent existential crisis.
That urgency, that need to maximize everything, it actually has a name now, doesn't it?
It does. Oxford University Press, after tracking all these language trends, came up with its word of the year for 2025.
And that word was?
Ragebait.
Which is just perfect. It so perfectly captures the dynamic.
The definition is absolutely vital for understanding our current ecosystem. They define Ragebait as online content deliberately crafted to be frustrating, offensive, or provocative to generate anger, clicks, and shares.
So the anger is the point, it's the product.
Correctly. Notice the mechanism at work. The system that distributes the news, the algorithm, is explicitly blamed. It's the algorithmic amplification of anger.
Which means anger isn't some incidental byproduct of the digital age.
Not at all. It's the core, highly profitable product being traded and maximized.
And from that one term, Ragebait, you can see this whole vocabulary of digital despair branching out.
Yes. If Ragebait is the word of the year, then its close cousins are things like doom scrolling.
Where you just can't stop looking for bad news, even though it makes you feel terrible.
And concepts like reductive relations, where you're encouraged to shun complexity, to shun nuance.
Everything is black or white.
Zero or hero. There's just no space left for, measured discussion or the kind of uncertainty that comes with dealing with reality.
And this isn't just happening by accident. This move toward a reductive environment can be a very deliberate, very strategic tactic.
It absolutely can. Political strategists like Steve Bannon have talked about this openly. He described an approach of flooding the zone with shit.
A lovely turn of phrase.
Isn't it? But the goal is specific. To overwhelm, to distract, and to disorientate the media, and by extension, the voters.
So the sheer volume of content is the weapon.
It's designed to make complexity impossible. It forces people to retreat into the emotional safety of a simple, extreme narrative, even if that narrative is terrifying.
Because it's easier to process.
Much easier. This is where quantity just completely outstrips quality, creating what some people are now calling slop.
Slop.
Yeah, that just dizzying rate of disposable, low-quality content that AI models and clickbait farms churn out, specifically to overwhelm any kind of reasoned thought.
Which leads us directly into this strange psychological downturn we're seeing in the UK, the public opinion paradox you mentioned earlier.
Exactly. If the headlines are constantly, day after day, confirming that everything is collapsing, you eventually start to believe it.
Regardless of what you see when you look out your own window.
Regardless of the objective data surrounding you.
And the polling data we've looked at it's pretty stark. You really have to see the specifics to grasp the scale of this internal crisis.
It's incredible. As of late 2025, you have 71% of Britons judging the country to be heading in the wrong direction.
71%. That's the highest level of pessimism recorded since that specific polling series began back in 2020.
But the most dramatic figure, I think, relates to political leadership. The Prime Minister's approval ratings
plummeted to a net negative 66.
Which, to put that in historical context for you, is the lowest satisfaction rating Ipsos has recorded for any prime minister. And they've been tracking this since 1977.
So worse than any leader during the financial crisis, the Iraq War, the winter of discontent.
Worse than all of them. And the chancellor's ratings are just as bad, mirroring the historic lows we saw during that disastrous mini-budget back in 2022.
Okay, so that data is, it's undeniably devastating. It confirms a huge crisis in public confidence. But what's the pushback? What's the evidence against the conclusion that the country is just in a terminal decline?
Well, the analysis suggests this extreme dissatisfaction is actually disproportionate to the objective conditions. It seems to be driven primarily by this corrosive digital culture we've been talking about.
So it's a crisis of perception more than a crisis of reality.
In many ways, yes. The researcher Chris Clark, who analyzed these trends, noted that today, the lows are lower.
What does that mean exactly?
It means the swings into pessimism are far more extreme than they've been historically. He argues this depth of dissatisfaction is precisely driven by a culture which seems hardwired to doubt and destroy, and it's all amplified by the algorithm.
Which makes it almost impossible to govern.
Especially if you're an establishment party. In this environment, the algorithm always favors the populace, the ones who are free to shout from the sidelines and offer these really simple, extreme solutions to very complex problems.
And this is where the paradox becomes, as you said, blindingly clear. When you zoom out beyond the domestic mood and look at brand Britain,
Right, how the country is perceived externally by global businesses and other nations.
Because if the UK were genuinely in a terminal tailspin, you wouldn't expect anyone to want to invest here.
You wouldn't. And yet, the data shows that global business leaders rank Britain as the second most attractive country for investment. Second, just behind the US. And that's the country's highest ranking in 28 years.
28 years, that's a huge disconnect.
It's massive. And it's not just one metric. The Anhalt Ipsos Nation Brand Index, which is highly respected, ranks Britain 5th globally out of 50 countries.
And that looks at things like soft power, culture,
institutions, people, values, all the fundamentals. So this undeniable discrepancy, a country that's objectively prized by the world, yet is gripped by this deep domestic despair, it really proves that the crisis is largely one of perception.
A perception cultivated and amplified by the toxicity of the online world.
That's the core of it. And this toxic polarization is maintained by what some call the myth of absolute consensus.
The idea that everyone is at one extreme or the other.
Yes, the digital world gives you the impression that political polarization is total. But when you actually look at nuanced polling, the reality is far more moderate.
I think the national debate over housing policy is a perfect example of this. You've got this tension between YIMBYs and IMBY.
Yes, in my backyard versus not in my backyard.
And online, the conversation is constantly framed as builders versus blockers.
As if they are two warring, highly polarized factions ready for battle.
But the polls tell a different story.
A completely different story. When pollsters look closely, they find most people don't fall neatly into those two extreme camps. Most people, in fact, intuitively lean towards YIMBYism. They support building new homes, especially in the right places.
But they don't think they're in the majority.
That's the critical psychological finding. They are convinced they are in the minority. The data shows that 72% of those who oppose new homes, the self-identified NMBYs, wrongly believe they are in the majority.
So a small, loud group can completely skew the perceived reality for everyone else.
Because they are consistently active online, and they are consistently rewarded by the algorithms, the perceived extremism just completely outstrips the actual division in the population.
And you see the exact same pattern with the debate around immigration.
Exactly. It's always ranked as the top issue in the public issues index, which leads to the assumption that everyone is animated by extreme positions on it.
But that's not quite right, is it?
It's not. I mean, you can't deny the issue has high salience. But the nuance is that just over half the public don't actually spontaneously place immigration among the most important issues facing the country.
So it's important, but not the only thing people care about.
And beyond that, there's a clear degree of, let's say, pragmatic permission for a balanced approach to immigration, a position that's entirely lost when the digital conversation demands absolute, extreme zero-sum positions.
And the power of the negative narrative here is, it's huge. The fact that 56% of the public thought net migration had increased in 2024.
When the actual government data showed the numbers had halved, it's a perfect example. The facts simply fail to penetrate the existing negative story.
So the core driver here seems to be this constant societal pressure for simplification, for certainty.
It's a function of what some are calling the twitchy 20s. If real life feels complex and uncertain, the emotional release of a simple, certain, and even a disastrous narrative becomes profoundly appealing.
It gives you a momentary sense of control. You feel like you know why everything is bad.
That's the psychological trap laid by the attention economy. And the only way out, really, is a deliberate, conscious choice.
To adopt what the research calls cautious understatement.
Hyperbolic overstatement. It means actively resisting that algorithmic pressure to maximize everything, whether you're talking about a local policy debate or global dynamics.
Okay, so we've examined the symptoms of this digital pessimism in the UK. Now let's dig into the science to understand the mechanism. There's some fascinating research on online discourse in Indonesia that gives us a clear view of how platform architecture amplifies polarization.
Right, especially when it intersects with sensitive identity issues.
And Indonesia is a really crucial place to study this.
It is. I mean, it's the world's third largest democracy. But it faces these persistent and growing concerns about how political polarization and online toxicity combine.
And often that hostility gets directed at vulnerable minority groups.
Exactly. In any healthy democracy, you expect ideological differences. That's normal. It's necessary for debate. The problem is when polarization becomes extreme.
It warps the landscape.
It does. Opposing groups start to see each other not as opponents with different ideas, but as existential threats.
And when you move that conflict onto digital platforms,
the discourse just degrades into hostility very, very quickly.
So to really understand this, we should probably define the two key concepts from this research. What's the specific difference between political polarization and toxicity here?
That's a great point. So political polarization in this context is defined as the divisive opinions held by two or more politically oriented groups on, substantive issues. It's the ideological divide.
The what they believe.
Exactly. Toxicity, on the other hand, is about the how. It refers to the harsh, aggressive, or impolite language that is intended to cause emotional distress, disgust, or anger.
So toxicity is more the behavioral outcome of that deep polarization.
Precisely. It's what drives users away from the discussion and leads to widespread self-censorship because the environment just becomes too hostile.
So just to be clear, toxic language isn't always polarized, and polarized discussions aren't always toxic.
That's right. But the design of these systems tends to merge them. It creates this destructive feedback loop.
And that's the core of the problem, this destructive, vicious cycle.
Yes. Polarization fuels toxic language. And that toxic language then reinforces the polarization. Social media platforms just act as accelerants.
Because they enable anonymity and almost always unchallenged expression of extreme views.
Which just deepens the societal divides. This cycle is especially pronounced in politically charged environments. It takes normal disagreement and escalates it into outright hostility.
Into what's being called toxic polarization.
A state marked by high loyalty to your immediate in-group and just open contempt or even hatred for the out-groups.
The research used machine learning on a massive data set to actually quantify this relationship. What did the technical experiments show?
They used a data set of over 28,000 unique Indonesian texts, and the results confirmed a really significant measurable correlation.
And the core finding was?
That using polarization as an added feature in the model significantly enhances the detection of toxicity in a piece of text. And it works the other way around too.
So if you know something is polarized, it's much more likely to be toxic.
Yes. For example, running a logistic regression model to predict toxicity only using the polarization label.
Yeah.
That still gives you an AUC-ROC score over 0.68.
Okay, so for those of us who don't live and breathe machine learning metrics, what does an AUC-ROC score of 0.68 actually tell us in plain English?
It tells us that these two things are not statistically independent. The fact that polarization is such a strong predictor of toxicity, even on its own, means they almost always manifest together.
So the systems we use online are basically creating an environment where the most polarized content inevitably becomes the most toxic content.
It's often the default output of algorithmic amplification.
Yes. Now let's bring in the factor that just multiplies this conflict, identity. We're moving beyond just ideology to identity-based polarization.
And that's a critical shift in the research. In diverse societies, these variations in cultural, social, and political identities, like ethnicity or religion, they act as incredibly volatile fault lines. They just intensify the divisions.
And being exposed to different identities online, you'd hope it would build bridges, but that's not always what happens.
No, sometimes it can actually reduce in-group and out-group trust, which is the absolute foundation for any kind of constructive dialogue. The link is strong. Heightened identity-based polarization is frequently associated with an increase in online toxicity.
Which is then specifically directed at minority and vulnerable groups.
Almost always. And this Indonesian data set was unique because it was the first to multi-label for toxicity, polarization, and the demographics of the annotators themselves, all in a non-Western context.
That demographic data seems crucial. How did it affect the results?
It was essential. It allowed the researchers to test the real-world impact of these identity markers. And when they incorporated specific demographic information, ethnicity, where people live, their religion, it significantly improved the model's ability to classify polarization.
So the model got smarter because it understood who was speaking and who they were speaking about.
Exactly. This hybrid approach, combining the demographic data with the text analysis, allowed polarization detection to reach really impressive performance levels. It got an F1 score of 0.748.
Okay, so again, translating that F1 score for the rest of us.
It means the model became highly effective at classification. It's a clear signal that identity is not some peripheral factor in online conflict.
It's central.
It is absolutely central to shaping how these digital conflicts play out, especially in highly diverse societies.
The researchers also found something interesting about the subjectivity of it all. They said polarization was harder to detect than straight-up toxicity.
That's a really crucial finding, especially for anyone trying to moderate online content. It suggests that while toxicity, identifying harshness, insults, profanity, is relatively easy for human moderators to agree upon.
Polarization is trickier.
It's much more open to interpretation. Determining if a comment is deliberately designed to promote conflict between groups is highly reliant on cultural context. This leads to lower agreement between the human coders.
But even with that subjectivity, the main conclusion holds firm.
The fundamental conclusion holds. Polarization and toxicity are dynamically linked, and identity factors are the key to predicting where they'll erupt.
Understanding that link, that the algorithm rewards the simple hateful extreme, makes the idea of pivoting to constructive discourse seem, well, pretty challenging.
But also critically necessary.
Yeah.
And we do see real-world counter-efforts. The work of a communications specialist, let's call him Leo, in a multi-ethnic hub in the region is a great example.
Leo's story really illustrates the difficulty of rejecting that algorithmic temptation, doesn't it?
It does. In the past, the easy strategy for getting views was always to lean into identity politics.
The us versus them rhetoric.
Exactly. Use inflammatory language to stir up a political frenzy. It's guaranteed to deliver immediate viral outrage and clicks because it's playing the algorithm's game.
Yeah.
It's exploiting the very mechanisms we just talked about.
But Leo's firm decided to take a different path.
A very deliberate shift. They moved toward constructive discourse and nuanced storytelling.
They chose to reject the explosive language.
You did. So instead of inciting division over, say, a public health initiative, Leo spent weeks crafting a campaign that focused on sharing stories of families from different ethnic and religious backgrounds.
Who are all experiencing the exact same practical struggle.
Yes. Trying to access basic health care, trying to find stable work, the things that connect people rather than divide them.
And this approach, it didn't break the internet. It wasn't Ragebait.
No, it didn't get millions of angry comments. But the primary goal had shifted. It was about slowly, professionally, building public trust, finding common ground through shared human experiences.
It's a quiet, professional movement trying to bridge that gap between the loud, extreme political rhetoric and the practical needs of diverse societies.
So the lesson here is pretty clear. While the algorithms reward outrage and the simple destructive narrative, the difficult essential work of governing and maintaining social cohesion requires a deliberate pivot.
A pivot toward the boring, constructive truth.
It means rejecting those reductive relations in favor of complexity.
And building on that need for a constructive pivot, when we look at nations actively trying to manage these digital forces, we see some governments in the Asia-Pacific developing some pretty sophisticated defenses.
Right, and they're going beyond just simple censorship. They're focusing on what you might call algorithmic awareness.
They're trying to train their citizens to be the circuit breakers that interrupt that rage cycle.
That's a great way to put it. And the story about Uncle Tan in Singapore really encapsulates this behavioral change.
He's a retired teacher, right?
Yeah.
And he got taught in that loop.
He did. Like many people, he found himself consuming more and more of this sensationalist content that was making him anxious, making him feel like his country was, well, falling apart.
What was the turning point for him?
He participated in a government-sponsored digital literacy workshop. And afterward, when he encountered a viral clip designed to trigger panic, he did something different.
He didn't just share it.
He didn't. He paused. He actually checked the source.
Huh.
And he consciously recognized the emotional hook, that immediate sense of personal insult or outrage.
And he just disengaged.
He made a deliberate cognitive choice to close the application rather than share the content. And that anecdotal success reflects a much broader strategic response being implemented across Singapore and Malaysia.
These digital literacy frameworks, they're being adopted as a key policy response.
It's exactly. To mitigate the destabilizing effects of Ragebait and maintain social cohesion. The goal is to give citizens the self-awareness and the tools to recognize when their emotions are being leveraged for someone else's profit.
Singapore especially has become a real focal point for this kind of governance innovation with its law, POFMA.
The Protection from Online Falsehoods and Manipulation Act. It was introduced back in 2019 specifically to tackle the rapid spread of falsehoods.
It's a strategic legal response, but to understand it, you really have to grasp the constitutional context there, which is quite different from, say, the U.S.
Very different. Critics often argue that laws like this curtail free speech, but the legal framework in Singapore treats the issue differently.
Their constitution, Article 14, does protect free speech.
It does, but, and this is the key part, it simultaneously recognizes that this right is not absolute.
So there are built-in limits.
Expressly. The Constitution states that restrictions can be imposed in the interests of public peace, order, and morality. POFMA is built right on top of that foundation.
And the High Court has affirmed this.
Yes. The court has ruled that the right to free speech does not include the right to disseminate falsehoods. That specific act is considered destructive of the democratic society.
So the law is laser-focused. It's not about unpopular opinions. It's about verifiably untrue statements that could cause public harm.
Precisely. And that distinction is the key operational difference from their prior laws, like the old Broadcasting and Telecommunications Acts.
Which had much broader powers.
Much broader. They could order the takedown of opinions or even true statements if it was deemed to be in the public interest. POEMA is intentionally constrained. It focuses only on false statements of fact.
Which means satire, criticism, genuine political commentary, that's all still protected.
As long as it doesn't contain a verifiable factual falsehood. Yes.
So what can the government actually do under this law? What are the tools it provides?
It's a calibrated suite of tools designed to address the falsehood while minimizing disruption. The most common one and the least intrusive is the correction direction.
What does that entail?
It requires the website or social media account to publish a correction or a link to the accurate information right alongside the original false statement.
So the original content stays up, but with a warning label, essentially.
Exactly. The idea is to let the audience see both sides and make an informed judgment. But there are tools for escalation if needed.
Such as?
Well, they can issue stop communication directions to halt the further spread of a falsehood, or targeted correction directions if it's only a specific group that's been exposed.
So you could target users just in a certain city or who follow a certain page.
Right. And for more severe cases, like clear manipulation using bot farms or fake identities, the government can issue takedown orders or, critically, account restriction directions to shut down those sophisticated bot networks.
Now, a major criticism of any law like this, especially from a Western perspective, is the risk of a chilling effect on legitimate speech, the fear that the government will just use it to silence dissent.
And that's a valid concern. The framework attempts to address those risks with some explicit safeguards, mainly focusing on rapid judicial oversight.
So you can challenge a government order.
Yes, the law incorporates direct rights of appeal to the courts, ensuring that any executive action is subject to independent scrutiny.
And that appeal process is quick.
Extremely rapid. Unless the appellant requests a delay, the high court hearing must be fixed within 6 working days after the papers are served.
6 days? That's fast. It minimizes the time a potentially legitimate statement could be restricted.
And beyond that, the constitutionality of TOFA was rigorously tested and affirmed by the Court of Appeal. They established a 5-step legal framework for the courts to use.
A checklist for the judges.
Essentially, yes. It guides them on whether to set aside a correction direction. The government has to prove the material is a statement of fact, that it's genuinely false, and that the order is necessary in the public interest. It's a stringent constitutional review.
And you can see how this would be applied in a multi-ethnic society where a single piece of misinformation could cause real friction.
Absolutely. We've seen it invoked, for instance, regarding false allegations designed to inflame religious tensions.
Like the claim about a political party fielding a Christian evangelist to get votes.
That's a perfect example of the strategic intent. POFA has been used over 160 times, and the majority of those orders relate to politically and socially sensitive events, especially the COVID-19 pandemic, and things that risk inflaming racial or religious tensions.
So it's seen as an essential tool to prevent the spread of misinformation that could destabilize public sentiment and social harmony.
Especially in these highly sensitive geopolitical situations where a falsehood could just pour gasoline on local tensions. By correcting verifiable falsehoods quickly and publicly, the government is trying to mitigate that risk of escalation.
Okay, so if that's the specific national level response, let's zoom out again to the broader regional context. How is ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, approaching the related challenge of AI governance?
It's a different approach. The global landscape for AI rules is really fragmented. You've got over 160 different sets of principles floating around, most of them coming from wealthy OECD nations.
And ASEAN has chosen its own path.
It has. It's adopted what's commonly called the soft but ethical model. This is anchored by their ASEAN Digital Master Plan 2025.
Soft but ethical. What does that mean in practice?
It means it deliberately favors flexibility and non-binding frameworks. So instead of a rigid, punitive legal mandate like the EU's Comprehensive AI Act, ASEAN promotes voluntary guidelines.
So it's more about principles than rules.
Exactly. Ethical principles focusing on transparency, fairness, accountability, things like that.
And what's the rationale for that soft law approach? Why not just copy the EU model?
It's really driven by the region's incredible diversity, both economically and technically. ASEAN includes states at very different stages of technological maturity and regulatory capacity.
So a one-size-fits-all approach wouldn't work?
It would stifle innovation and be impossible for smaller states to implement effectively. So this soft but ethical approach promotes trust and allows individual member states like Malaysia with its Data Protection Act or the Philippines with its own privacy laws to adapt AI governance to their specific needs without killing economic activity.
It's about building capacity first, before imposing strict controls.
That's the idea.
But as we saw with digital polarization, that kind of flexibility has its own challenges, right? Especially when you're dealing with huge global tech companies.
That is the inherent tension, absolutely. The main challenge is that a lack of enforceable obligations creates regulatory uncertainty.
If compliance is voluntary, you risk some actors just not bothering.
Exactly. You risk inconsistent adoption of ethical practices, especially among those motivated solely by profit. And this softness might limit interoperability with international regimes that do enforce rigorous standards, like the EU AI Act.
Because if you want to do business in Europe, you have to follow their rules.
Right. And experts in the region are very aware of this. They argue that ASEAN must eventually explore stronger, legally binding frameworks, but adopted in a responsible way to keep these powerful technologies safe and centered on human values.
Especially with the rise of generative AI and these sophisticated disinformation campaigns that pose clear national security threats.
It's a moving target, and the governance has to keep up.
So we've established that the digital ecosystem cultivates this anxiety, but governments in the Asia-Pacific are strategically developing these multi-layered defenses.
From individual digital literacy, like with Uncle Tan, to robust legislation like POF-ME, and these collaborative, soft, but ethical models for AI.
Now let's apply this same shift in perspective to one of the most widely sensationalized topics in global geopolitics and economics, China's Belt and Road Initiative.
This is where that digital hyperbole really takes on immense geopolitical dimensions. The narrative of China's debt trap diplomacy is just. It's incredibly pervasive.
It's simple, it's emotionally compelling.
And it fits perfectly into that reductive, zero-sum, good versus evil framework that the attention economy absolutely loves.
The narrative paints China as this strategic predator, deliberately ensnaring developing countries with loans they can't repay.
And it portrays the recipient nations as completely helpless victims who are forced to give up their sovereign assets.
So if we apply our principle of cautious understatement here, what does the rigorous available economic evidence actually tell us about the BRI's true nature?
Well, the consensus among researchers who really dug into the specific financial and political mechanisms of the BRI is that the evidence challenges that simplistic debt trap narrative on almost every key point.
Okay, so point one.
First, the primary driver of most BRI projects is overwhelmingly economic factors. It's a genuine need for infrastructure, not some centrally coordinated grand geopolitical strategy from Beijing.
And second?
Second, China's development financing system is actually highly fragmented and, frankly, poorly coordinated. You've got dozens of competing profit-seeking state-owned enterprises, or SOEs, and different banks all doing their own thing.
So it's too decentralized to pursue the kind of detailed, top-down strategic objectives that the debt trap theory requires.
Exactly. And most crucially, the nature, the scope, and the direction of most of these projects are determined primarily by the recipient governments themselves.
So the agency rests with the borrower, not the lender.
The local domestic, political, and economic agendas are what's really in the driver's seat.
Let's look at a concrete example that illustrates this gap between the digital perception and the physical reality. The East Coast Rail Link, the ECRL in Malaysia.
A perfect case study. If you're a logistics manager in Kuantan, let's call her City, and you only read the sensationalist headlines online, you would believe the ECRL is a total white elephant.
A failing monument to political ego, I think, was one quote, destined to bankrupt the nation.
That's right. But for City, her daily tangible reality is that this physical railway cuts shipping times across the peninsula in half. It drastically improves her company's bottom line and the economic efficiency of the entire region.
The function and immediate benefit of the infrastructure completely contradict the viral political narrative about its funding.
And the deep research confirms that in Malaysia, these controversial megaprojects were driven primarily by intense domestic concerns and local political maneuvering.
Not by some grand strategy from China.
Not at all. That's the core finding. The decisions were driven by commercial, economic, and internal political imperatives within Malaysia itself. It reflects what one analysis aptly called both need and greed.
Need and greed. Explain that.
The need was for genuine infrastructure. The greed was that the ruling elite used these massive projects as tools to cultivate political support and feed patronage networks, often through kickbacks and regional favoritism.
And the most serious financial issue in Malaysia at the time wasn't an external debt trap.
No, it was the massive domestic corruption scandal related to the Sovereign Wealth Fund, 1MDB.
Where an estimated $7 billion was misappropriated by local figures.
Exactly.
So how did that domestic scandal connect to these Chinese-funded projects?
Well, this is a classic example of elite self-dealing. The prime minister at the time, Najib Razak, instigated grossly inflated loan arrangements with Chinese entities for the ECRL and two major gas pipelines.
Why inflate the loans?
The primary immediate purpose was not to fund Chinese strategic goals, but to siphon off a significant portion of those funds to secretly bail out the heavily indebted 1MGB fund.
Unbelievable. So the Malaysian government was using Chinese loans to cover up its own corruption.
Essentially, yes. While senior Chinese officials certainly helped broker the arrangement, the inflated, problematic deal was explicitly requested by the Najib regime. They then funneled the money to repay their troubled sovereign wealth fund.
So the narrative that China just ensnared a hapless Malaysia is...
It's historically flawed. The local regime essentially trapped itself and then used Chinese funding to cover its tracks. And it's important to remember, even during this period, the IMF judged Malaysia's public debt position to be generally manageable.
Okay, we have to talk about the most famous example, the one that underpins the entire debt trap diplomacy thesis globally. Sri Lanka and the Hambantota port.
Yes, the story you see everywhere.
The one that says China lent Sri Lanka money, waited for them to default, and then seized the port for debt relief to use as a naval outpost.
That conventional account, while very compelling, is systematically dismantled by the actual research.
So let's break it down. First, who wanted the port built?
It was decisively initiated by the Sri Lankan government itself. It reflected strong local political motives. Specifically, President Mahinda Rajapaksa wanted to direct these massive, prestigious projects to his home district. It was about catering to high-level local elite interests.
And China's role in the beginning.
Well, their engagement wasn't some top-down geopolitical strategy. It was strongly encouraged by one of their own profit-seeking, state-owned enterprises, the China Harbor Engineering Group, or Chikija.
So the company was driving the project.
They successfully lobbied the Sri Lankan government to transform what was a modest plan for a fishing harbor into the much larger, much more expensive mega project we see today.
So again, the origin of the problem is rooted in local elite ambition and corruption, combined with the profit motive of a specific Chinese company.
Not a centrally coordinated master plan from Beijing. That's the inescapable conclusion.
And what about the actual debt crisis? The narrative is that Chinese loans were the cause.
And that's perhaps the biggest distortion. The true cause of Sri Lanka's debt distress arose mainly from the mismanagement of local elites and the country's significant exposure to Western-dominated financial markets.
What were the numbers on that?
By 2016, research shows that only about 3% of Sri Lanka's total external government debt was actually owed to China.
Only 3%. That's a critical piece of information that gets completely buried.
It does, because it doesn't fit the simple, sensational headline.
So if it wasn't the Chinese loans, what was the primary driver of the crisis?
The crisis was precipitated by financial decisions made in Western capitals. Specifically, the winding down of quantitative easing in the U.S. and the global tightening of liquidity from 2013 onwards. That sent a massive shock through their system.
Because Sri Lanka had borrowed heavily on the open market.
They had taken out huge amounts of short-term borrowing from international capital markets. As global interest rates rose, their borrowing costs shot up, in some cases doubling. Their currency, the rupee, fell 36% against the dollar.
Which makes servicing foreign debt incredibly expensive.
Exactly. Over 58% of their debt was denominated in dollars and bonds held by Western investment funds. The repayments on the Hambantota port loan represented only about 3.3% of their total foreign debt servicing costs at the time.
So claiming Chinese loans caused the crises.
It's a massive oversimplification designed to fit a pre-existing narrative.
And finally, the supposed seizure of the port. The most viral part of the story. What actually happened?
The seizure narrative is unequivocally false. When Sri Lanka faced its liquidity crisis, China did not forgive the debt, and it did not seize the asset.
So what did they do?
A Chinese state-owned enterprise, CM Ports, paid the Sri Lankan government $1.12 billion to lease the port for 99 years.
They bought a lease?
A commercial lease. This payment gave Colombo the financial injection it needed to stabilize its economy and, critically, to repay its other creditors.
The Western-dominated bond and financial markets?
Primarily, yes. So the original debt to China actually remained in place. The lease was a commercial arrangement that gave the struggling government cash when it desperately needed it.
And the claims that China seized it for a naval base?
Those have completely failed to materialize.
This systematic debunking really shifts the focus, doesn't it? It moves away from a simplistic China the predator narrative to one that demands a much closer look at local governance, accountability, and the global financial system itself.
That is the necessary conclusion. The research highlights pathologies on both sides.
On the Chinese side, it's this fragmented financing system.
Right, with profit-seeking SOEs that often prioritize commercial returns over strategic goals. But the far greater pathology, really, lies with the recipient governments,
where local elites exploit these massive infrastructure projects.
They use them to cultivate political support and feed patronage networks. And that exploitation, whether it's through kickbacks or regional favoritism, introduces serious financial and political risk into the system.
So, given this more nuanced reality, what are the key policy recommendations? How do you improve governance in this context?
The most important takeaway for responsible development is that the primary burden of reform falls squarely on the recipient governments. They have to take far greater responsibility for rigorous project viability assessments,
financial sustainability,
and implementing transparent regulatory environments so they can bargain effectively with all foreign partners, whether they're Chinese, Western, or multilateral institutions.
And what about for the non-BRI states? The Western nations that often drive the negative hyperbolic narrative.
The recommendation for them is to stop treating the BRI as some monolithic, strategically directed entity driven by geopolitical malice.
And instead,
they should focus their efforts on providing attractive, credible, and alternative development financing options to these countries, rather than just standing on the sidelines and criticizing Chinese engagement.
Compete, don't just complain.
Precisely. And finally, for civil society and political opposition groups within these countries, the focus should be on demanding comprehensive transparency.
Public participation around project design, feasibility studies, pricing, management.
All of it. That kind of transparency is the necessary foundation for pursuing political and financial accountability and for pushing back against elite self-dealing.
So we've taken a deep dive today into how this pervasive atmosphere of digital hyperbole, this rush to Ragebait and KPS, LOSK arguments, actively distorts our perception of reality.
Whether we're talking about the UK's subjective sense of political collapse or the global geoeconomic narrative of China's debt trap domination.
The constant search for a crisis narrative often obscures a far more complex reality.
A reality defined by local agency, by nuanced governance efforts, and by economic progress that is, simply not viral.
And that complex truth includes sophisticated attempts by governments to provide a constructive alternative.
We've seen Asia-Pacific nations implementing legal frameworks like Singapore's POEMA, which establishes these clear, legally defensible lines around what constitutes a punishable falsehood versus a protected opinion.
And the broader ASEAN trend toward soft but ethical AI governance.
These are quiet, professional movements. They're attempting to apply constructive solutions to digital chaos, but they rely on an essential choice from you, the consumer of information.
The choice to prioritize facts, critical context, and cautious understatement over algorithmic sensation and collective despair.